Hey IB environmental students, today we're going to be talking about ecological succession, changes over time in an ecosystem. This is in your topic 2 objective notes, so make sure you got them out. Alright, let's begin. What is succession anyways? Well, look down below at this figure. You'll see that it is the orderly process of change over time in a community, usually after a disturbance. It can occur in either land or water ecosystems. Here's an example. Remember, IB always calls examples named. So this one is in fact in Washington State, Mount St. Helens, which in May 1980 exploded, which was very unfortunate. There were some fatalities, sadly, but what was really crazy was a lot of people didn't quite expect this, and this wonderfully diverse hillside was no more. So we can see here now that the trees have all fallen down. This is a natural disturbance example. And over time, 30 years later, we've gone from originally before the explosion a place with lots of trees and ecological diversity to not much still around. A little stuff now growing on the bare rock. And that's because this orderly process starts sometimes with bare rock or soil, and slowly different types of organisms will accumulate. But that accumulation or species diversity happens quite slowly after the disturbance. And in this named example, that disturbance was a volcanic eruption. All right, that's our named example. Let's keep going. There are some differences between succession and zonation. Zonation is how different abiotic factors change in an environmental gradient usually. This one, in fact, is the environmental gradient of altitude. You can see different organisms live at different altitudes. Versus succession is change over time. Notice that time factor is very important for these definition differences between succession and zonation. So here's another example. I know the figure is kind of helpful, but why is this zonation and not succession? Well, once again, we have an environmental gradient. This time it's depth of water, not just altitude. And depth of water is going to change other abiotic factors like light, temperature, amount of dissolved oxygen, and different organisms can live in different zones. Succession, on the other hand, is change over time. Remember that Mount St. Helens example? Here we can see after some natural disturbance or human-caused disturbance, we have change over time. Notice the time on each of the photos. So succession versus zonation is all about time. That's succession, not about time, just about an environmental gradient, zonation. All right, let's talk about the stages of succession next. The first stage is called the pioneer community. Remember, pioneer usually means first to an area. These organisms are usually rather resilient. They can reproduce very quickly, and a lot of organisms. For instance, moss and lichen are frequently found in very tough to live areas because they have a symbiotic relationship where both of them benefit. This allows them to be rather resilient in quite yucky places, like just on bare rock. This relationship is mutualism since both of them benefit. So one more time, pioneers are first to an area. The next stage of succession is called the seral stage. This stage is which species start replacing each other, gaining in size slowly over time from small grass to herbs to shrubs, and eventually to small trees. The last stage is the most diverse of all the stages, and sometimes we refer to it as mature, called the climax community. Usually here, the different organisms in the community are now no longer changing. We could refer to it as a stable equilibrium stage. So we've gone from this middle stage, seral, now to the mature stage. We have a lot of large trees now compared to these smaller trees gaining in mass. We've also accumulated some soil on the ground. We've also gotten a lot more biodiversity, which will lead to more complexity in our food chains. So if we were to compare these different types of stages, we could compare the early succession stage to the late succession stage. I would definitely draw this little chart in your notes. This is the first of two. This is one's about structure differences between the early and late stages of succession. So plants are going to be much smaller in the early stage compared to the later stage. The diversity is much lower in the early stage. There's a lot less niches in the early stage, and most organisms can live in a lot of different places like that moss or lichen. And the organization of the community is low because there's not a lot there. Versus later, there's a lot more species, a lot more places for them to live and different jobs. They're bigger. So this is the structural differences. Our next slide's going to have the function differences. So our function differences, early succession, very little biomass. Remember how tiny those lichen were? Versus the big, big trees later in the climax community. Primary productivity, remember productivity is about energy. It's the rate energy is converted to organic matter. You can think about it as how much photosynthesis is going on if we're talking about primary productivity. It is very low at the beginning stage. Remember how tiny lichen were? They're not doing that much photosynthesis. Later, those big trees, though, are doing tons of photosynthesis. Because of the diversity, we have a very low diversity and complexity in the food chains early on and much higher later. Nutrients aren't going to move through the system very easily because there's not a lot of players to move them through, not a lot of decomposers available, just lichen and rock usually. And then later on, a lot more players, a lot more decomposers, and hopefully some more soil, so a lot more nutrient cycling. And then how much is energy being used that's coming into the system through solar energy? Not a lot in the early stages. But at the later stages where there's a lot more producers, there should be a lot more energy being used. All right, next we're going to compare two major types of succession. Those two types are called primary and secondary, and the difference is, does the succession start on soil or rock? Primary succession takes place on rock, a place where there has never been life supported there before. So imagine a new lake that has formed, and there's not much below except for pebbles, a new pond, very new cooled lava, maybe sand, or just purely bare rock from a rock slide or something like that. And because of the rock, there's not a lot for the plants or even the lichen to grab onto. So this is going to be a very slow succession. A lot more time's needed until we get to some soil layers. And then eventually we get soil and more biodiversity, more energy use, and more just creatures in general. So that's compared to secondary succession, where you can see immediately looking at the picture, I have soil, even at the beginning. So this is a faster process because it starts on, and because the soil's there and its abiotic factors are there, there's a lot for the other organisms to live off of, like the right pH, hopefully, maybe some minerals. And because of that, it's a faster process than the primary succession that was on bare rock. Some human activities potentially could cause secondary succession. Here they are. Some of them are farming. Some of them are just cutting down trees, human construction. Sometimes animals like cows or sheep overgraze fields and eat too much, and that could cause succession to occur. But some things are just natural causes, like our volcanic explosion from Mount St. Helens. Some of that area left some soil, and some of it might have just been bare rock, though. Forest fires are a huge one, especially in dry areas. Hurricanes and tornadoes are happening much more frequently during these climate change times. So this succession idea is really interesting because it's all related to a balance, or how we think of equilibrium. And we really want to have stable equilibrium because we hope that over time, even if we have a natural disaster, we'll continue to always go through these orderly stages and get back to a climax community. That's only going to occur if I'm at a stable equilibrium and I'm having negative feedback loops. However, if I suddenly have an unstable equilibrium, I might not get back to my old climax community. All right, that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. See you in class.